Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2 is perhaps the most well-known passage in the book of Daniel. In this study, I'd like to look at what modern scholarship has to say about this chapter, in addition to looking at some of what ancient Judaism and ancient Christianity has had to say about this passage. But first, let's read the text. Now, this first line is important because we're going to talk about the dating that is used here. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, The word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your house shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and its interpretation. They answered a second time and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know with certainty that you are trying to buy time, because you see that the word from me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, There is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand, for no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, or it may possibly be translated that they were already being killed. And they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, Why is the decree of the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. And Daniel went in and requested that the king appoint him a time, that he might show the interpretation to the king. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter. Therefore Daniel went in to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. As indicated in the reading a moment ago, the first line here is important because this is a line where some allege there's a contradiction here created between Daniel chapter 1 and Daniel chapter 2 that cannot be resolved. Again, the text says, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Now, Longman will define the issue for us. He says, the first verse sets the scene in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, whereas the first chapter says that Daniel's training lasted for 3 years. This is difficult to reconcile with chapter 2. After all, since Daniel was included among the condemned wise men and was living outside the court, the assumption is that he had already graduated. So you see the issue here. Nebuchadnezzar comes to power, and in the same year that he comes to power, 605 BC, is the year that he takes Daniel and his friends away and puts them in training. They have to be in training for 3 years. Well, then how is it that here we are in chapter 2, and we're in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and somehow Daniel's 3 years of training have already elapsed, and he is outside of training and living outside of the court. How could this happen? So you can see that the tension here is chronological. How do we fit 3 years of training into the first 2 years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign? Now, some suggest that trainees might be considered among the wise men, and therefore Daniel was still in his training when this happened. But in chapter 1, Daniel's training ended with meeting Nebuchadnezzar for the first time. In other words, you can't say, well, chapter 2 took place while Daniel was in training. Maybe he was considered one of the wise men even though he was still in training. This isn't going to work because Daniel is going to appear before Nebuchadnezzar and interpret his dream. Well, if chapter 1 suggests at the end of his training, at the end of 3 years, he came in and met the king for the first time, well, then he couldn't have already met him in order to interpret his dream. So we're back where we started. We need somehow to explain how Daniel has already gone through the 3 years of training and can now come in and interpret the dream in chapter 2, and we need to explain how he could possibly have already gone through those 3 years of training when it's only the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Basically, there are about 3 possible resolutions for this passage. There may be more, but these are the 3 that I think have the best potential. And for the first one, we want to call on an idea that we invoked in the last chapter, that the way Babylonia reckoned time and the way it discussed the reign of a king is different than how Hebrews did so. So sometime in the year 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar comes to power, and this is not counted as his first year. According to Babylonian parlance, this is called his accession year. Now, in this same year, he takes Daniel and his friends away to Babylon, and this begins the first year of their training in order to serve the king. Then the next year, 604 BC, this is counted as Nebuchadnezzar's first year, even though technically it's the second year of his kingship. According to Babylonian reckoning, it would only be counted as the first year. And of course, this would be the second year of Daniel's training. Then finally, the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, or at least what would be called the second year, is his third year. And this would correspond with the third year of Daniel's training. So how do we resolve the issue? Well, when it says that Daniel and his friends had to be in training for 3 years, there's a certain looseness in the language, especially in the ancient world, but not even just in the ancient world, even in the modern world. If I were to tell you I intend to move at the end of the year, you're not going to strictly understand me as saying I'm going to move on December 31st. If I moved at the beginning of December, if I moved at the end of November, you would still count this as me keeping my word that I was going to move at the end of the year. Now, this looseness in the language is especially possible in the ancient world when we're talking about the number 3. We talked about this last time, and I gave some examples that the number 3 was used very loosely with a lot of imprecision in the ancient world. So when it says that Daniel and his friends met for 3 years to do their training, it may not mean 3 full years, right? It could mean part of 3 years. And you see examples of this. For example, a good one that I didn't share last time is in 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 9 and 10, where siege lasts from the 4th to the 6th year of Hezekiah's reign. It's between 1 and 2 calendar years long. And the biblical writer says that it was 3 years, even though it wasn't technically 3 years. 3 years is just, a way of saying for a little while. Now, if we take this same kind of logic and apply it to Daniel, well, then he may not have had to, be in training till the very last day in his third year. He could have graduated, and thus we have a window of opportunity, right? He gets out sometime of training. He gets out of it in 603 BC while it's still the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. He meets with Nebuchadnezzar, impresses him with his wisdom like he did in the first chapter. And now we have a window of opportunity here in the rest of the year where Daniel is a new wise man, where he could have perform the actions that are attributed to him here in chapter 2. Now, this is one possible resolution. We have a couple of other possibilities to consider. The second possibility involves considering the land of Israel as the geographic center of the book. The book of Daniel seems to be Palestine-centric. That is, it seems to have a bias in favor of the land of Israel over all other lands, which should not surprise anybody who has read the Bible before. And this could change things. As it says here in the first bullet point, the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign refers not to the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's kingship, but to his direct control over Judah. Consider back in chapter 1, where Jehoiakim and Nebuchadnezzar are both kings. Jehoiakim is a king over Judah, and Nebuchadnezzar is king of Babylon. But only one of them is discussed in terms of a reign, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. In the book of Daniel, the reigns are discussed in relationship to the land of Judah and to the city of Jerusalem. There may be many kings, but the one that we're going to talk about as presently reigning is whoever is reigning over Judah and Jerusalem. Now, this is going to get us out of our problem if this is true, because as Pace says, Nebuchadnezzar's complete rule over Judah, without the presence of Judean puppet kings, occurred after the key events of the second deportation, the burning of the temple, and the death of Zedekiah, all of which took place after 587 BC. In other words, in 605 BC, all right, well before this, 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar comes. He takes Daniel and his friends away to deportation. They have their 3 years of training, and Nebuchadnezzar does not take personal control. Babylon does not take direct control over Judah and Jerusalem until almost 15 years later. Right? They had Judean puppet kings. Judah was a vassal state. They paid tribute, but they were not directly taken over by Babylon until over 15 years after Daniel gets out of training. And so when it says the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar here, it doesn't mean the second year of his kingship. He's already been a king in Babylon for over 15 years. It's talking about the second year of his reign over Judah and over Jerusalem, again, because the book of Daniel is Palestine-centric, because whoever is reigning, that language is in relationship to the land of Palestine. As I indicated a moment ago, this book is very concerned with the land of Israel. It's the only land that later on, when other countries and territories are going to be discussed, the land of Israel is called the glorious land, the beautiful land, etc. And so if this is the case, this resolves the problem. And I might point out that arguments like this have been around for a long time. Josephus got to this passage. Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century AD, he got to this passage, and he said that the second year of his reign here refers to Nebuchadnezzar's reign over Egypt, not simply his reign in Babylon. Now, no one's going to follow Josephus today because there's no evidence that the book of Daniel is Egypt-centric. Rather, the geographical center of the book is the land of Palestine. It's the land of Israel. And so this may very well be the type of argument that's going to resolve this. The reign refers to the reign over Palestine, not his kingship in general. The third possibility suggests that the text may not have originally said the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar at all. It may have said the 12th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, obviously, if this story takes place in the 12th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, whether we consider the reign of Nebuchadnezzar to be his direct control over Jerusalem or just his reign in general, this is going to solve the problem. And the idea is, in the Aramaic in which this story was written, the way you say 12 is to say 2, 10, right? And the audience should know to add 2 and 10 together to get 12. Well, if early on in the scribal transmission process, if the number 10 dropped out, and it ended up just saying in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, then that created a problem that did not originally exist in the text. Now, this perspective is supported by some manuscript evidence. We do have one ancient manuscript which says the 12th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Papyrus 967 is a 3rd century biblical manuscript that was discovered in 1931. Contained many fragments of the Old Testament in Greek, as well as the book of Daniel. So if we go this route, the 12th year, we do have some support from Papyrus 967, and this would definitely solve the problem. Now, if this is the case, if the text did originally say the 12th year of Nebuchadnezzar, this has some interesting connections with the book of Jeremiah. And again, Daniel is very concerned with the book of Jeremiah. He'll make a direct reference to it later on. According to Jeremiah's chronology of Judean and Babylonian reigns, Nebuchadnezzar's 12th year would correspond to Zedekiah's 4th year. On this year, a scroll written by Jeremiah describing the ultimate punishment of Babylon was to be carried to that city, read aloud, and thrown into the Euphrates as a symbol of Babylon's ultimate destruction. This is very interesting because if in the 12th year Jeremiah had a prophecy of Babylon's destruction, it's interesting that here in the 12th year Daniel has a prophecy about a time when the Babylonian Empire will come to an end and will be superseded by other empires. Another connection. It was also the year in which Jeremiah opposed Hananiah's optimistic prophecy of the early return of the first exiles. So some exiles were taken away to Babylon. Hananiah, the false prophet, said, no, it's not going to be that bad. God's going to bring them back real quickly, and the exile is not going to last that long. And in which Jeremiah declared Nebuchadnezzar had been given sovereignty over the nations and even the wild beasts. Now, this is very interesting because if in the 12th year of Nebuchadnezzar, Jeremiah says that Nebuchadnezzar has been given power over the wild beasts. Well, in this same chapter, in Daniel chapter 2, the same claim is going to be made about Nebuchadnezzar, that he has control even over the wild beasts of the field. And so these thematic connections are very interesting. And if we follow Papyrus 967, we don't simply have these thematic connections. They all take place in the same year. Now, most scholars are not going to do this because Papyrus 967 is just one manuscript. All the other manuscripts say second year. And so picking one manuscript over all the others is going to be problematic for some. But if Papyrus 967 is right, this is interesting because it has all these correspondences with the book of Jeremiah. And so those are three possibilities. You oftentimes find in literature that people will mention a alleged contradiction like this just long enough to point out that the Bible is wrong, and then they move on, and they leave the audience under the false impression that no possible resolution could ever be proposed or ever has been proposed. I just want to show you this is not the case. These things are not that simple. There are always a number of possibilities. Now let's focus on the story. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. Now let's talk about these categories of religious experts that come in to stand before the king. Now the magicians provoked divination. That is, they did specific things to get a message from the gods or from the unseen realm. They provoke divination, including the casting of lots. They do that in the Bible. Laconomancy, which means observing the patterns of oil on water. So you're going to drop driplets of water, of oil on the water, and you're going to see if they kind of spell out a message or make a certain image, which the religious expert can interpret. Libinomancy, which means observing the patterns of smoke, much the same thing. You create smoke and then you look at it and you see if it spells out a certain message or creates a certain kind of picture. Questions to the priest that could be answered affirmatively or negatively, such as the Urim and Thummim in the Old Testament, that's the Israelite counterpart to this practice, or necromancy, calling up the dead. Now, magicians also had unprovoked divination. In other words, they would interpret things that they didn't provoke the message from the gods, but they got a message nonetheless. This included changes in natural phenomena, migration of birds, apparent human and animal births. If something was born deformed, these guys would come and interpret it as an omen. Astronomical phenomena, dreams, as well as a myriad of other everyday occurrences in people's lives. These are the sorts of things that magicians would do. Now, the reference to enchanters may be similar to what we would call an exorcist. They were a specific class of Babylonian experts skilled at diagnosing and combating evil powers that were attacking a person. Sorcery is used only here in the book of Daniel, so it's kind of hard to tell what it might refer to, but as Pace points out, elsewhere in the Old Testament, sorcery is associated with the abhorrent practices of the Canaanites, including child sacrifice, the casting of spells, and necromancy. So they may have had their hands in a number of practices. And Chaldeans is just kind of a blanket statement. The magicians, the enchanters, and the sorcerers, they were all kind of in the category of the Chaldeans. So these are the religious experts who are being threatened by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar and his magicians. Now we want to remember to read this text like a Jew in exile who's trying to preserve his identity, who's trying not to be infected by paganism. A Jewish audience would snicker at the claim that the gods are so distant that they do not live among people. This is what it says here in verse 11, that the magicians tell the king that the thing he is asking for is difficult, and no one can show the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. And the reason this would have been so laughable to the Jewish audience is because they did not think of their God this way. God for them came to dwell among people. He dwelt among men. He walked with their fathers in the wilderness wanderings. He came to live in the tabernacle. He sat enthroned above the Ark of the Covenant. He now lives in Jerusalem, according to 1 Kings chapter 6. Their God is near because he is actually God, as were the pagan religious experts. They talk about their gods as being a long way away. The Jews see a contrast here. They see a difference between their God, who is near and imminent, and the gods of the Babylonians, who are so distant, because they are in fact not really gods. Now, although some early and some modern interpreters have thought Nebuchadnezzar's request meant that he had forgotten the dream, it is much more likely that the demand has to do with the balance of power. So Nebuchadnezzar knows that he can tell them the dream, and they're just going to interpret it and tell him whatever he wants to hear. He has no way of knowing if they actually have some sort of supernatural gift. And so that's what he's trying to check for here. Most likely, he has not forgotten the dream. He knows it, but he's bothered by the dream, and he really wants a good interpretation. Well, how can he trust their interpretation? Well, if they can tell him what he actually dreamed, well, then he knows that they have a supernatural gift. Otherwise, he doesn't like the kind of power his magicians have, where they can flatter, they can interpret, they can say what he wants to hear, and he rewards them, and all the while they have manipulated them. Nebuchadnezzar, he wants something. He wants to retain his power. He wants them to prove themselves. He wants something that is more authentic than that. Now, I want to take a brief excursion here to talk about Arioch in the Jewish imagination, because he had quite a tradition develop around him. Arioch is the man in the story here who works for Nebuchadnezzar, and he goes in and sets up an appointment for Daniel so that he can meet with the king and interpret the dream. Arioch is identified in Jewish tradition as the same as Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard who supervised the deportation of citizens to Babylon. So in the book of Jeremiah, Nebuzaradan comes in, and he's the one who's in charge of making sure that certain Jews are taken away. He oversees that whole process. Now, he shows mercy to the prophet of Jeremiah, allowing him the freedom to remain in Judah after he had been bound for deportation to Babylon. And they saw this as a preview of his repentance. Jewish tradition admired his integrity and preserves a tradition that he became a convert to Judaism. So we find this in certain ancient Jewish midrash. We find this in the Talmud. Jews like this guy. He was, a Gentile convert. He had shown mercy to Jeremiah. He had shown mercy to Daniel, etc. Now that you can take Arioch and conflate him with Nebuzaradan, there's no good evidence for that. This is just Jewish imagination at work. We have no real evidence from the text that either one of these figures converted, but it's just interesting to see that these types of speculations really would gain foot in Judaism and would be passed down for centuries. And Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. Now, it's important to note that it's appoint a time, not get some time, as it's oftentimes translated in certain versions, because he's not going to get some time to go and get an answer. Nebuchadnezzar's already gotten on to the magicians. He says, I know you're just trying to buy more time. Well, Daniel can't go in and request, to buy some time and get what he wants here. It should be translated that he appointed a time. He's saying, hey, we'll have an answer to you. Just give me a time to meet. So this is interesting because Daniel makes an appointment to give the answer before he has one to give. Right? He makes the appointment in verse 17. God doesn't give him an answer until verse 19. So here you can see that Daniel is the epitome of faith. Why does Daniel take fast action to save the Babylonian wise men? Now, this is so interesting to me, and I found this kind of striking when I read it. Ancient Jewish and Christian interpreters were bothered that Daniel saved the wise men's life. In fact, in verse 24, he specifically says, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in, and I'll give an interpretation to the king. And many Jewish and Christian interpreters thought, well, he should want them to die, right? These are idolaters. These are not just idolaters, they teach idolatry to other people. Why would he do anything to save them at all? As Calvin says, Calvin suggested Daniel's sense of honesty compelled him to admit he could give an answer. Otherwise, he would have preferred to wait and thereby ensure the death of the idolaters. So in Calvin's mind, Daniel's like, man, I really do want those guys to die. I want the magicians to die. I want the Chaldeans to die. They should all die. And that would really be a step in the right direction. But I'm such an honest man. I need to go in and tell Nebuchadnezzar that I can get him an answer. And so my honesty compels me to save their lives, even though I don't want to do so. Modern interpreters, and I think rightly, point out the fact that loving one's enemies or having mercy on those who are evil is not an invention of the New Testament. As it says here in the book of Exodus, if you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to return it. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you falling down under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help them with it. In other words, having mercy on the evil or loving your enemies, this goes back to the earliest parts of the Old Testament. This was not invented with the Sermon on the Mount. And so to think that Daniel must necessarily want the death of all these idolaters is a false assumption, and maybe tells us more about the Jewish and Christian interpreter than it does about Daniel. There's nothing wrong with the fact that Daniel wants mercy for these idolaters here. Daniel shows himself to be the model Jew, and that's what this section here is all about. In verse 17, Daniel goes to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. And he seeks God through community prayer. He doesn't just go off by himself and seek God. He gathers the family of faith around him. He says we need to seek God together so that he will answer us. He is a man given to the prayer of the community. And then in verse 19, when the mystery is revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night, he blesses the God of heaven. He doesn't just run straight to Nebuchadnezzar and give him an answer or whatever. The first thing he does is praise and give thanks to God. He is definitely being presented to us here as sort of the model Jew, the guy you want to follow. Now, God is referred to in this passage as the God of heaven. Believe it or not, this is not a common way of referring to God across the Bible, but this phrase becomes more popular around this period, around the Persian period and the Neo-Babylonian period. Now, Newsom speculates that the God of heaven was a popular way for the Persians to refer to Israel's God because they thought he was comparable with Ahura Mazda, the Persian deity concerned with cosmic and societal order. So this is Ahura Mazda, and in Zoroastrianism, the Persian religion, there was, it was a dualistic system. You had a good god and you had an evil god, and they had equal power. And so that's why the cosmos and the human experience is this war between good and evil. You have the good god and the evil god, and they are equals. Now, obviously, Christianity is not fully dualistic. We believe there's a conflict between good and evil, but we don't think it's equal. God, the good God, has no equal opposite. If Satan has any kind of an equal opposite, it would be Michael. It wouldn't be God. So we're not dualistic in the sense that the Persians were dualistic. But if you're a Persian and you come in contact with the Jewish people, you're going to say, well, our God, Ahura Mazda, who created everything and maintains order, that's very similar to the Jewish God. And so they would take this phrase, the God of heaven, and this is the phrase that they would use, the title they would use to describe the Jewish God. Now, that may be the case. I think it's more likely that this is a polemic. Jews live among Persians who talk about this God this way, and they're saying, no, he's not the true God of heaven. Yahweh is the God of heaven. And they're taking this honorary title away from Ahura Mazda, and they're giving it to Yahweh as a way of saying Ahura Mazda is not the God of heaven, but Yahweh is. Daniel's prayer of thanksgiving. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. And we want to note the association between wisdom and might. And then he goes on to describe his wisdom and might. He has the might to change times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings, etc. Then he discusses his wisdom. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things, etc. And then these attributes that belong to God, Daniel says he's given to him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might. Now, this is a curious thing, because in what sense has he given Daniel might? Right? Daniel does not have the might, the strength to overthrow Nebuchadnezzar. He does not have the strength to fight his way out of Babylonian captivity. And what we find then is we are back to making this comparison between the power that comes through military strength and political strength, and the power that comes through divine knowledge. Knowledge is power in this scene. The king who is feared for his power is powerless to know the meaning of his own dreams. He fancies himself as important, but he is simply one flashpoint in God's historical progression, which involves the constant rise and fall of kings. But the Jew who worships God and has knowledge of him has a lasting power that political power cannot rival. We want to keep on the table of our minds this comparison between political power and divine knowledge. Which one is stronger? Which one is more important? Daniel and his comrades, they are ultimately stronger than their captors because they have a divine knowledge that lets them know there is purpose in their suffering, and they know how things pan out in the end. They know that the inevitable progression of history is in the direction of justice, and that ultimately the sufferings of the righteous will be rewarded. Now, the most interesting aspect of this chapter is by far the statue itself, what the different sections of the statue represent, the different empires and kingdoms, and how we know and how we line each section of the statue up with different empires. And I was going to do that in two videos, maybe spend the next 20-30 minutes talking about the statue and then do another video that is part two, but I've decided not to do that. We've set the stage with this video, a shorter video than usual, I am well aware, but next week we will just go through the interpretation of the statue and the different views that have been offered, and I think that will probably take the entirety of our time. Will probably be about an hour-long video, so I hope you will join me for that.